G'day, I'm Kate Watson, and my guest this week is John Anderson. Many of you listening will remember him from the Howard years, 1996 to 2007. John Howard was Prime Minister, Peter Costello was his Treasurer, and for a large part, John Anderson was leader of the Nationals, making him, under the coalition agreement, the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. I could tell you all about his politics at the time and give you plenty of reasons to make judgments about him before you've listened to this interview. For that reason, I won't. I can tell you, though, that he is a sixth-generation farmer and grazier from Western New South Wales, and importantly, he has somewhat accidentally built quite the media business. He now has a YouTube channel with hundreds of millions of views and 700,000 subscribers. Just to put that in context, Hamish and Andy is the biggest podcast in Australia and had 900,000 downloads last month. On both counts, these are numbers media companies like ours can only dream of. So the reason I wanted him on is because he's a newsmaker, no doubt. But what is it about what he's saying, producing, that's getting so much attention? Listen on to find out. John Anderson, pleasure to have you. Thank you for taking the time. I want to start by asking you to describe in your words why you started having the conversations that you're having on your podcast and your YouTube channel publicly. What's your sort of overarching mission? What are you trying to achieve?
Well, Kate, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I hope I don't put you and your listeners all to sleep at the same time. I'll do my best. Look, I had a long time in the federal parliament. I left relatively early, and then the great financial crisis hit. And after the great financial crisis, as someone who'd been part of a government that thought economic management really mattered because it develops jobs and opportunities, and particularly for young people, when I started in the parliament, youth unemployment in Australia was staggeringly high. I thought all those things really mattered. And then after the GFC, right around the Western world, it struck me that no one wanted to clean up the mess. No one wanted to make the sacrifices. Governments everywhere were chickening out. Their people were saying, no, don't ask us to pay the price of cleaning up the mess and all the big debts that governments had run up. And I was talking to a friend one day, and he, not me, made the observation, people are really interested in this stuff. Why don't we think about a podcast series? And then we had coffee, the two of us.
So what year are we talking about here?
2016.
Yeah.
So a few years after the GFC, but the fallout was still there.
Yeah.
And we'd been talking about this lack of political leadership, revolving door, prime ministerships, ministerial positions, bureaucrats not staying long enough to get on top of their brief, and it all looked like a mess. And we were talking to the eminent historian who was in Australia at the time, Neil Ferguson, and he'd said some really interesting things along with his wife, Anne Hersey-Ali, at a small private dinner the night before. And we said, do you reckon we could capture some of this and put it out there for people who weren't at the dinner but might be interested? And Neil very kindly said, yes, of course. So we recorded one with him. Then I recorded some others, Peter Baldwin, who's a very clear thinker from the left, Tony Abbott, a clear thinker from the right. We put them together as a contrast. But then a young person said to me, Jordan Peterson's in town. Why don't you do a conversation with him? I said, Jordan who?
He was really just starting out then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I watched him in action in front of about 1,000 people, mainly young. That was the important part. I was staggered as a former politician. How do you get an audience like this? They gave him a standing ovation. I'd never heard of him. Who is this guy? He's not a rock star. He's not a political leader. And all these young people know who he is. I thought, gee, this podcasting world is serious. So he agreed to do a conversation. We already had several in the can, but we did one. I really enjoyed it because he knew his Russian history and how cruel communism got to be in the 1930s. And that's a period that really interests me, how not to do it well for your people. It was horrible what happened in the 1930s in Soviet Russia. And we put it up. Just watch the dial going over and over and over and over. And it put us on the map overnight.
And just for those who don't know who Jordan Peterson is, he's a Canadian professor who wrote a book called The 12 Rules for Life, which was far and away a bestseller. It sold millions of copies, as I understand it, worldwide. Seemed to really resonate with young men. Is it safe to assume that the audience of people listening to you week in, week out, whenever you release an episode, are men?
In the early days, we had a weighting towards older men, but Jordan Peterson kept us alive amongst the younger men.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and this is not a judgmental statement, we're all the time trying to appeal as widely as we can. Young men are now just as likely to tap in as older men. We know that. They mightn't listen to quite as much. Perhaps they're a bit more time sure.
The attention span.
No, I'm not going to make that accusation. I think we're just busier stages of life.
Yeah, true.
The important point is they're just as interested in ideas. And many of them are pretty worried about where things are going and will I have a future and what's it look like. And many of them are saying, actually, I want to do something worthwhile with my life. How do I tap into good thinkers? And again, this is not judgmental, but we do know that younger women in particular tap into podcasts and the content just as much. It's just that they're less interested than the young fellas are because they tend to concentrate on sport, politics and the economy and business.
Whereas women, it might be more lifestyle, culture. Interestingly, our audience is predominantly women, 80% female, and we are heavily news, business and politics, I would say. So they're out there.
Oh, absolutely.
They're absolutely out there. But the reason I asked that question is you wrote a piece in the AFR just after the whole Joe Rogan, Kim Williams incident happened. So Kim Williams, for those listening, is chair of the ABC. He said that he wasn't a Joe Rogan enthusiast and that his podcasts prey on people's vulnerabilities. You wrote in response to that, and I'll read you back what you wrote and then you can comment on it. Men are tired of the superficiality and bias in so much of the mainstream media. They're going to alternative platforms to get what they want, not what journalists and media tycoons are pushing. You called out men specifically in that piece. Why?
Because it's research-based. My political hero was a man called William Wilberforce. He was the man who led the charge against slavery. A remarkable man. Never left the backbench, but was probably the most influential politician and British person of his time when Britain was a superpower. And he wrote at one stage to a young person who asked him for advice. He said, you will get people who will give you many opinions and you'll get some people who will give you facts. I find generally it's better to go for the facts. And so the fact is that a lot of young people, men in particular, have become very disillusioned with mainstream media and they are going online and you can tap into any amount of bad stuff of every genre online. But it also can be a very useful tool for unpacking ideas. And so we're trying to make sure that we're providing some good high-quality conversation that's of interest and where people can tap into good thinking.
I'm interested in challenging you on that because there is certainly commentary around that says this shift. And I mean, I've thought about this a lot in the context of, you know, a lot of women listen to our podcast. As I said, where are men getting their news if they're not getting it from mainstream media, which as we know is in decline? Where are they going and where are they turning? And is Joe Rogan a good thing? And is whatever they're listening to? And there's the Andrew Tate conversation, which is completely separate. But
no, but it's an important one.
It's an important one. What are they listening to?
Yeah.
So please pick up on that.
You asked the question and I failed to answer it fully. The point about Joe Rogan is you can't say I think he actually used the word repulsive, these repulsive characters. It was very strong language that he used. That's a blanket accusation. And I would be the first to say, yeah, with algorithms working the way they do, you can get online and listen to an Andrew Tate endlessly, and that's a bad thing in my view. That's not a good thing. You can do, as I confess happens to me a little bit, you can listen to your own favoured ones all the time. You've got to force yourself to say, I better listen to some alternative views. But I think the point about Joe Rogan, who had a 3-hour conversation with now President Trump, and it obviously influenced a lot of people. For the chairman of the ABC to say that's just repulsive and to write off the staggering number of people who listen to it and to not inquire, as the ABC ought to, why are they reaching people that we're not? What is it that's missing in our product? Why is it that people are prepared to sit down and listen to 3 hours of getting to know someone? The ABC at its best, I mean, I'm a great admirer of the Conversation Hour, for example.
It's a great podcast.
Well,
great radio show turned podcast, yeah.
And you know, here's a call out for Richard Vidler.
Yeah.
I think it's superb. But it's not what the ABC does in its so-called investigative programs and its current affairs programs. It's not what they do. And the chairman, by writing somebody off, there are plenty of people in that space that should be written off, but there are plenty performing a valuable service. And I would say, on balance, Joe Rogan's one of them. He didn't deserve the condemnation, neither did his listeners.
Which it brings me to this like sort of trend towards personality-based news and information, and whether that is a good thing or not. It kind of is the thing, regardless of whether we think it's good or not. It is where people are going, and news comes in all sorts of forms, right? I mean, whatever news and information you need, there's all sorts of topics. But I guess as someone who is a personality with a very large audience, how do you maintain, or what do you say when people say, well, you might not be giving all the perspectives that you need to give, or you might not be providing balance? Do you feel that you do that, or do you feel that that's not your role?
It's not my role. I don't want to be unbalanced, and I don't want to be unfair. But I saw a comment the other day, well, he says the ABC's not balanced, he's not balanced. And somebody immediately responded to that by saying, no, but he's not paid by the taxpayer to provide all balances. What he's doing is providing the stories and the content that mainstream media is not doing. So there are some areas, for example, I pay almost no attention to at all because others do it. They're doing it. They're probably doing it better than I could. But there are many areas where I think the public debate is undercooked. I think it's undercooked on economic management and the way, a good economy is about good outcomes for people. It's not for sweet numbers' sake. It's for good outcomes. We've got a cost of living crisis. It's because our economy is being very badly run. By the way, I think if we're not careful, it will be a permanent and structural decline in our living standards. It won't be temporary. It won't be easily fixable if we don't change course very quickly. I am very, very interested in security. So I often talk to people about how prepared are we if something goes wrong, even if we're not involved in a war. I'm a farmer. We need diesel. There are certain inputs we have to bring in from offshore. We haven't stockpiled enough here. We thought during COVID that we would. Our government said they would, and we haven't. We don't do enough on defence. I often talk to people who have done a lot of research on raising children and young people in particular, because I'm really distressed at how badly our young people are doing.
John, you're a religious person of Christian faith, very publicly. It's something that I understand you came to after a really deeply tragic accident in your life. Do you want to speak to that? I think it helps people understand your story, and I don't think many people would know it.
Well, no, I don't want to talk to it, but yes, I will, because I decided when I watched Jordan Peterson talk about the difficulties of life and watched young men responding, and I realised what they were looking for was real life. They wanted steak, not thin gruel. They know life's tough. Life's tough. Life's gritty. And so I thought at that time, well, all right, if it's helpful to people, and SBS at about that time also asked me to go on a show that they were conducting where they talked to people, had people on a panel who had been inadvertently and accidentally the cause of someone else's death. A train driver, somebody throws themselves on the track or whatever. And I said I wouldn't go on the panel. I felt that was inappropriate, but they asked would I talk about it privately. So I did. And the SBS sort of let me tell some of the story, the bit that was, I suppose, a bit gut-wrenching and then not so much my way through it, which I was a bit frustrated by. I didn't think the editing was very fair.
Because that's kind of the reason why you tell it.
Well, it is the reason you tell it.
Yeah.
And when I said to the person I thought was the producer, oh, no, I'm not the producer, I thought, I give up. I thought it was buck passing. Anyway, look, I grew up, my mother and father married very late because their lives were horrendously interrupted by the Second World War. That's another story.
Oh, I didn't realise that.
Yeah. My father was given up for dead in the Middle East in the great Desert Storm, if you like, pushed back against Rommel at Al Alamein. And was so badly wounded that the doctors gave up on him, but he pulled through. but it took him a long time to recover. So he married quite late. He was getting on for his late 30s when I was born. He was a very keen sportsman, so every afternoon it would be cricket or shooting or boxing at the end of the day on the farm. And then in a front yard, because we don't have so much a backyard as a front yard out on the farm, we were playing cricket. He was a more gifted sportsman than me, but I found the sweet spot and was belting the six-stitcher all over the place. I drove one through hard and long past him, and it headed straight for my sister, which is an extraordinary thing, really. She turned away instinctively. She was playing with the kitten, just watching. She wasn't participating in the game. And it caught her in the back of the neck, and she staggered to her feet and made a few steps towards my father and died in his arms. And obviously that is a freakish accident. Because it happened to me and some people know about it, I've since met people who have been through that sort of experience, and it has been helpful. I can think of a couple of young people where I've been able to say, look, you don't believe in yourself anymore, do you, because of this? And they've said no. And I've said, well, I do. I've been there and people kept believing in me, so that helped me through. But the way I would describe it, it presented me with a three-sided dilemma. Why suffering? This is so terrible. You know, it shattered my family. My mother had already died by then, so my father particularly, it was a dreadful setback for him. I don't know how he kept going. He had no faith at all. Why suffering? Does anybody understand? And the Christian story is yes, that's what the cross is about, taking suffering in order that we can be relieved from it. Is there any hope? Yes, the wounds can be bound up, which is another way of saying, by the way, I don't think life ends at the grave. And so, yes, I am a believer, and I tell the story because I feel duty-bound to do so, in a way to honour my sister, in a way to honour, hopefully inadequately I know, God, but also to honour those who are grappling with tough things in their own lives. You know, those three big questions. Why am I suffering? Does anybody out there understand? Will the wounds ever be bound up?
And you were like 15 maybe
About
at the
15,
time.
mid-teens.
And then you tell the story that, and I think in the fairness of telling the full story, like it was that then meant that you were brought to the Christian faith in a much stronger way than it wasn't like you grew up around it.
Oh,
it
no,
wasn't,
no, I'd
you
grown
know,
up.
yeah.
Look, I went to a school where, chapel every morning, and I sort of thought this is ridiculous. But it was actually something said in chapel one day that got me, that was one of those shock moments. These days you'd probably ask for a trigger warning. But anyway.
I think, people who knew you when you were quite a public figure will know that story, but I think for most people they won't, and I think it helps understand all of the things we're going to talk about.
A journalist eventually asked me about it, and I told her in confidence.
I didn't realise that.
Yeah. I'd been in public life 10 years before anybody knew. And then it was during an election campaign sometime later that a certain paper decided to splash with it on their front page.
And published it.
Yeah, and even John Howard at the time, he knew nothing of it.
Yeah.
And he said to Peter Costello, I hadn't heard this story. Did this really happen? And Peter and I knew each other. He knew about it.
Do you think if that hadn't have happened, you never would have told it? Do you think you would have arrived here?
No, I wouldn't have told it.
Isn't that, yeah, wow.
But as I say, the trigger for being more open about it, I think one of the things we don't talk enough about in our culture is hope. We actually all need hope. We need to believe that there's a reason to carry on, that there's a purpose to it. If you're suffering pain, and a lot of people do, that it's not going to be like that forever. It's not the way it should be. It's not the way it's going to stay. There are options. There is light at the end of the tunnel. So I think hope's important. I don't think we talk about it enough.
So let me ask you then about how that relates to politics, because there is certainly my time of observing politics, sort of somewhat of a desperation to separate politics from religion in Australia. We're a secular society. We're not supposed to. A lot of leaders have been at pains to say, look, this is my religious view on something, but it doesn't influence my politics. Where are you? I mean, how were you on that when you were a politician, and where are you on that now? And how much should someone's religious view influence their politics? I mean, how can you separate the two?
You can't separate them. See, this is a great lie. My personal view is that everyone's religious. They all have something they bow before. They all have an ideal. Often it's a selfish one. And so I actually think there's such a thing of as a sort of a cult of environmentalism. Now, before people jump at me, I'm a farmer. I am deeply committed to the sound environmental stewardship of the land that I've looked after, and I'm delighted that those who have followed me are as well. And I can honestly say we will hand it on in better condition than we found it. So please don't jump at me. But there are people who talk about Gaia. What do they mean by Gaia? It's an old Greco-Roman term. The earth is God, Mother Earth. And Mother Earth is being offended by our abuse of Mother Earth. There's too many of us and we're too rapacious and we're destroying the environment. This is destroying hope, by the way, in a lot of young people. We know that. They tell us. I would argue that's a religious view, and I would argue that the very people who say, oh, you should leave your Christianity at the door when you go into the cabinet room, never seem to say you should leave your environmental views when they are plainly sometimes quite religious. They're never told to leave them behind the door. That was, a fellow cabinet minister was on the ABC one morning having a bit of a go at those of us who took faith seriously, and I'd include people like Peter Costello and Tony Abbott and me and that. You leave your views, your faith at the cabinet door. Well, you're not leaving your worldviews at the cabinet door. And besides, which bits would you like me to leave? My deep commitment to justice, because I do have one, to economic prosperity for the betterment of others, that's important to me, to the institution of family, that's important to me because I don't think our kids are doing very well since we've let our families break up. Which bits of those do you want me to leave behind? Because they do spring from my faith. In reality, in a democracy, you should have people around the table who reflect the diversity of views in the Australian community. And there are many people in Australia, we know that, particularly amongst immigrant populations, interestingly enough, who still take faith very seriously.
I guess the interesting thing, reflecting on you when you were in politics and when you left politics, 2005?
I stepped down as Deputy PM in mid-2005. Yeah. I'd had 10 years in Cabinet by then. And then didn't contest the 2007 election.
So you said at that time, you say on even just on your website, when you stepped down, you did so with a clear, optimistic vision of where this country was headed. I did. Where has the decline started? Like, has it been like a moment for you where you think, because what we're really getting at the heart of it here is that you think that there's a structural decline in the way that we live our lives. Yep. And there are all sorts of problems feeding into that. But when did it happen? Has it been a gradual thing, a gradual realisation for you personally? Or has there been a moment where you've gone, oh, boy?
Depends what you call a moment, but it was quite rapid, and I touched on it earlier. The so-called Great Financial Crisis, and you'll remember that, the world's currency system, banking system, nearly collapsed. It went within an ace of collapsing and would have been in something worse than the Great Depression, in my view, if that had happened. It was solved only by governments on behalf of taxpayers doling out staggering amounts of money, often irresponsibly. The example I always use is that, can you believe that the British government bought a whole lot of banks, the American government bought a whole lot of banks, and General Motors? They bought a motor car company. So the taxpayers suddenly owned a motor car company in the land of free enterprise because it wasn't allowed to fail. It was too big. It was too important. And as it settled a bit, see, I'd been part of a reforming government that had paid all Australian debt off. Australia got through the financial crisis in great order, partly because China kept buying our products and partly because we'd left money in the bank. No debt, no Commonwealth debt. Taxpayers did not owe the Commonwealth any money, or the Commonwealth didn't owe any money on their behalf. There was money in the bank called the Future Fund. And then I saw it being squandered. To some extent, it was fair to borrow heavily to get ourselves through the great financial crisis, which, by the way, had been participated by Lehman Brothers and a whole lot of other banking institutions, technically, apparently not breaking the law, but behaving in ways that I regarded as immoral, short-sighted, materialistic and greedy. In other words, reprehensibly. No one seemed to go to jail. So that was part of it. But then there's inability on the part of leaders to articulate the case, right, we've got to clean up the mess now for the next generation, and for people to say, yes, we'll go with you and we'll wear some sacrifice. And I remember, I know a little bit about how broad economics work. I remember thinking, we're setting ourselves up for an almighty fall here. We're talking about 2013, 14, because the only way out now is for governments is to create inflation. So they'll go on, central banks and governments, driving interest rates down, printing money, looking for inflation to devalue the debts they'd built up. And that always ends in pain. So for years they went looking for inflation that didn't happen, and then bang, it happened. And now you've got a cost of living crisis. So you see, you can't separate the two. Strong leadership, sound economic management on the one hand, serving people on the other, people being prepared to pull together in the national interest and the interest of our children and say, yeah, we've got to make some hard decisions. So
for those who agree with you that this isn't a good period, that we are on a structural decline, when we had COVID in amongst all of that, and I'm sure that's a whole conversation we could have separate to this one. I was like, should I go there? And I thought maybe not. But you've said publicly and on your podcast a number of times, it's there for the saving. Like it's not, all hope is not lost.
No,
to your hope point.
Never.
So what is your solution? Like, what is the great plan if you were to be the person in charge of having it?
No, there's always hope. There's got to be.
Yeah, of course.
It's got to be.
Yeah.
Sometimes you've got to go through the valley of death before we can find life again, and we need to face the fact we're getting it wrong. It's not working. It's not working for our people. We're not happy. We know that. All the indicators tell you. Everyone's stressed, anxiety levels, depression, self-harm, mental illness. So we're not doing it as well as we should. In a young, vibrant country like Australia, the raw numbers tell you on the economy, we've had 8 quarters of declining per individual wealth, per GDP wealth in this country, gross domestic product wealth. People aren't imagining the structural decline because they went looking for inflation, of course. People with assets have done better than ever. But people who haven't, young people in particular, trying to get their first foot on the ladder, it's really hard. That's why there's such a link between good economic outcomes and a healthy culture, and a healthy culture and good economic outcomes. You won't get a strong economy off a broken, disillusioned, distrustful electorate. We all want a good economy.
Let me come back to the solution question then, because what I did want to ask you about was something you wrote to this point, wrote recently. I'll just pull up the article. I know when you get opinion pieces published, you don't get to choose the headline, but the headline was "Why We Must Fight Back Against the Forces of Woke." I don't know if you wrote that or not. Was that your editor? Not that line. But the interesting thing in that piece, I put it in people's show notes, they can have a read, was that you actually tied wokeness to housing affordability. Can you explain that to people? Because haven't seen it done so articulately, and I think a lot of people listening, housing affordability is the number one question. Explain how wokeness speaks to whether you can afford a home or not.
Wokeness is, in a nutshell, what is the thing I was trying to say a moment ago earlier. It's the mindset that says, I won't make any sacrifices in the common good. I want to be looked after. I don't want to work cooperatively with our leadership to build a strong, productive economy that delivers for everyone. And it's reflected in that very poor response to the global financial crisis. I know all that sounds like technical jargon, but basically what it means is that a conservative approach to economics, where you balance the budgets, where you let the private sector get on with it, where you don't let the public sector get too big. You've got to have a public sector, but you don't let it get too big and swallow too many taxpayers' dollars, where you don't let inflation get out of hand. They're the things that a strong, vibrant culture that believes in itself will do and allow its leaders to do, and its leaders will step up and do it and not give way to the emotionalism of the day, the emotionalism that drives so much of the public debate. So it's a bit like, it's a very rough analogy. But, if you've got a serious medical problem, you can go to somebody who really can solve it. And it'll be highly technical and a bit, beyond your understanding, but they'll explain they're going to do the operation in this, that and the other way and so forth. Or as a friend of mine found out when he had cancer, his wife said, somebody said, if you drink gallons of beetroot juice, you'll beat it. Who are you going to listen to? One is emotion and hype and hope. The other is based in realism, the hard facts, and the real possibility of beating the problem. It's just not as appealing up front.
So wokeness to you is sort of a lack of rationalism and a lean towards just an emotional response to things.
Yes.
And then how does that impact whether people can buy a home or not?
Because it means that we're always expecting the governments to solve the problem without us participating, without us doing our bit, without us being prepared to say, well, one of the reasons that we're in trouble is that our debts are getting out of hand. Another reason is that our schools are full of ideology. I find it staggering. I think around 10% of English kids go to private schools. Around 5% of Americans. Here it's getting on for 40 in some states. Parents are voting with their feet. They're saying we want a higher standard of education, but we know from the research in Australia it's going down. They're spending far too much time on ideology, not enough time on the 3 Rs, and we know that this is research-based too. And when history is taught, that it's taught properly. That's what parents want. Whether they're getting it from the private sector, well, that's a whole other debate in itself. But there's a classic example, I think, of where, and look, again, people want to jump at me, but I say I'm a great supporter of education. I'm a great supporter of the public and the private system, and I have many members of my family who are school teachers, and I can number amongst some of them, young people who are saying, the classroom's now so out of control, I want to give it up. 70% of our teachers want to give it away. So teachers, don't hear me being down on you, but am I down on the curriculum? Absolutely, I'm down on the curriculum.
You have 4 grown children with their own kids. How does this conversation go down around the Anderson family table?
That's for other members of the family to comment on.
But is it like, you got to laugh. Is it that, that's that old boomer telling me, all of the problems with the world
Probably.
and it's really not that bad? Or
Probably.
Is it just a robust discussion in the way that, you would probably hope it would be?
I genuinely, my kids might be surprised to hear it, I try to lay off. It's hard for kids when their dad's been in public life and still is to some extent. I get it. That's hard.
And generations will always think they've had the worst or the best or the, whatever it might be.
They do.
One of the other issues you've talked about a lot is national security. And I think you connected the dots here for me in a piece you wrote. I think it might have even been the same piece potentially. But I want to ask you this because we have about 30% of our audience are regional based and the rest are metro. Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, and quite curious about each other, I think, and a genuine want to understand. You've written a bit about those in the city that are voting teal or independent and, independents get up in the regions too, so this isn't necessarily an isolated issue. But you said when the regions are strong, the whole nation prospers. It's easy for city dwellers to forget, but we would be massively impoverished without the food, fibre and export income generated by regional Australia. You go on to talk then about the issues facing regional Australia in particular, like supply chains, inflated bureaucracy, and then you talk about national security. What are you really worried about when it comes to our national security?
I'm a farmer. We produce really enough food for a lot of people as a family. As I look around the place, I recognise that we can't do it without a surprising amount of imported product, from fertiliser to chemical ingredients to diesel. There doesn't have to be a war that Australia is involved in for all of that to come crashing down. We know from a lot of detailed work that's been done that the stocks on hand we have of some of the key ingredients, and not the major ingredients. We've got the soil, we've got the labour, we've got the gear, but there are critical inputs which we're utterly dependent upon to feed ourselves and the tens of millions of people we feed in other parts of the world, which is something that brings me a lot of pride as an Australian. We feed a lot of people around the world, Australia's farmers, and we do it in one of the most hostile farming environments in the world. because they've always been. My family's been here since the 1820s. Floods, fires, droughts, famines, it's happened all the way through. Some of them have been horrendous. The so-called Federation drought, worse than anything we've seen in my lifetime. So that's part of it, and yet we put up this incredible performance. Australia's farmers now a tiny proportion of the population. It's only around 120,000 odd Australian farm businesses now. I think that's all there are. If you go back 125 years to Federation, 1 in 2 workers worked in primary industry or mining, keeping the country going. It's now probably below 3%, both sectors together. And yet they provide a staggering amount of wealth out of the regions that the country depends upon. And I find it unbelievable that particularly after COVID, when we were worried about the shortage of toilet paper and at one stage masks because they were imported, and everyone jumped around and said, we've got to make sure we've got our essentials here. We can manufacture them in Australia and we'll review the supply chains and so forth. What's happened? Where is it? Why do we still only have 3 weeks of diesel supply? Because the 3 weeks sounds okay. Well, surely, it wouldn't go on longer than that. Well, I don't know. It might. You could have our shipping lanes blocked. Mightn't even be a war for many, many months. And everything would grind to a halt. And without imported fertilisers and various other things, it would be a real problem. If our exports were blocked, all the things that so many people now want to stop, mining related and what have you, the ability to pay for our hospitals and people's benefits and the pension and what have you would start to be very severely challenged very, very quickly. And so that enormously, Australia's an exporting economy. It's a trade-based economy. We are very vulnerable.
It sounds a bit like Trump in the sense of a bit more, is what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are far too reliant on importing things into our country now, and just put it in layman's terms, things like diesel. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, at the very least, we ought to stockpile a decent amount of it.
Yeah, but I guess in this new world we're in now where we've got President Trump and he's sort of far more focused on producing US.
Yep.
Should Australia be more like that?
Let me divide it into 2.
Okay.
I would not for a
I
moment.
think you can tackle it.
Yeah, Australia's not America. I'm not arguing that. I'm not saying make Australia great again.
No.
Although I would like us to be better. I think.
I think you're kind of saying that.
I think. Look, I actually believe. Let's be bipartisan. I actually think that people who talk about the period of exceptionalism in Australia, from the beginning of the Hawke government to the end of the Howard government, are right. Our prosperity grew enormously. There were opportunities that people couldn't have dreamt of, particularly for young people. And, are we grinding that down? Yes, we are big time. So, yeah, I think we could do a whole heap better. But if the question is, should we get real about being prepared for something to go wrong in a much more urgent way, the answer is absolutely yes, completely, I do. I'll give you
What do you think? What could go wrong?
What could go wrong?
I think I know what you're talking about, but I really want you to articulate that to people.
Okay. All of our oil basically comes from Singapore, comes through the South China Seas. They're hotly contested. If something were to go wrong, it mightn't involve Australia at all, but a conflict breaks out over Taiwan or North Korea. It's a pretty unstable regime, hates South Korea. Say they sent a midget submarine, this is a real thing that's been war-gamed, into a South Korean harbour and blew up a ship. And Lloyd's Shipping just basically cancelled all insurance until they sorted the mess out and shipping was cancelled for a while. We're so dependent on that oil coming in, so dependent on it to keep our economy going, our groceries distributed, our food grown, our medical supplies carted around the country, our buses going, our trains going. It goes on and on and on. And I just wonder what our forebears would have said. Be a bit more resilient, be a bit more prepared for the unexpected.
It's the conversation, and it's one that I think people can wrap their heads around because it's happening a lot because of Trump. It's like sort of the problems of globalization, the problems with this. I mean, and I certainly grew up in a world where we were taught about that being such a positive thing, such a great thing.
That's true. We all thought it was.
And is it?
Australia did very well out of it for a while, and we're right now. We do have to question it again, Kate. You're right.
Okay.
There are limits. we have to be able to carry on if something goes wrong. And at the moment, we couldn't. We haven't. Look, COVID should have showed us that. The simple example of not having the masks on hand because there was only one manufacturer in Australia couldn't keep up with demand. So we've had the warning shots.
So I guess we are into solutions now because, there's that example. But what do you see broadly that we could change as Australians that would set us on what you think is the right path?
Well, that's quite a long list. I think we should again start to say kids matter. They really do. They're our future. Let's enjoy them again and be keen about them. That might sound a funny place to start, but I think it would be a good selfless place to start. And there's nothing, by the way, more powerful than having kids to make you realise others have had to make way for you and you've now got to make way for others. And given that we're inclined to be selfish, kids are a great way to go. I think we should be focusing on our education system.
So potentially even just policies around incentivising people to have more children again?
Certainly stop stigmatising the idea and stop the negativity, stop the fear-mongering. We're going into a depopulation bomb. It's going to bring us many or more problems than too many people.
I guess there's also, to your point, I think anything I've learned from this conversation is it's all tied to economics, and if people can't afford to have them, that's also part of the problem.
Oh, well, there's no doubt. You see, this business of weakening our economy has created problems with family formation. You know, young people all know that. And I think that's a terrible thing. So that's another thing you need to address. What do we do about the housing crisis? There are a number of things. There are quite a few things that could be done. There's no one silver bullet. There really isn't. But a concentrated national effort on this problem is needed, and it will involve all three levels of government and the financial sector. Well, where's the leadership on it? We've got to start the long march back through the institutions. Our universities should not be hotbeds of dissent over, things like anti-Semitism and what have you. They really should not be. I think we need to instill again the notion of public service. I think we've made it very, very discouraging for people to contemplate stepping up for public service, either in the public service or, frankly, in leadership position as politicians. We're all crying out for better leadership, but we so pile it on them. We somehow think that the poor old broken down horse that's trying to struggle up an impossible hill with a overloaded to blazes will perform better if we whip it to death rather than give it a good feed. Well, if you want better politicians, if you want a better horse, a more powerful horse to pull the cart up the hill in difficult times, feed it properly and support it when it's trying. We knock everything. We become too much of a nation of knockers. And I think that's bringing its own fruit. There are many political leaders that I admire in the country, but I also hear people everywhere saying I wouldn't do it for quids.
Yeah, it's a very, very common comment made by lots of different people. And
often by the very people that you think, I wish you would have a go.
I wish you would have a go, absolutely. I think that brings me to something I wanted to ask you about, and as we get towards the end of this interview, this challenge to the two-party system in the majority vote, the primary vote, for both of our major parties is very much on the decline. We've got this rise of the independents, as we sort of touched on before, but how problematic is that, do you think?
Very. Very.
And just explain to people why the two-party system worked so well for so long.
Let me give you one example that I've often used in the bush. They hated us at the time when we were first in government after 1996 because we were cutting expenditure everywhere, the Expenditure Review Committee. When the results started to flow, interest rates started to come down, the dollar started to come down, our terms of trade improved very significantly, real wages started to rise. This is really important for the first time in 20 years. We're in a living crisis now. We did the tough things then that got us out of a cost of living crisis where wages, it wasn't as bad then as it was now, but wages had flatlined for 20 years, 75 to the mid-90s, they'd flatlined. And they started to move again because we did the hard work. We're only able to do it because you had a unified, solid cabinet that stuck together like glue, didn't leak, made the hard decisions and then went out and sold them together. So I hear the supporters of independence. I had one say it to me the other day. My family member is, and I won't mention who, but it's one of the teals. And she's doing what you should have done, John, and what all politicians should do. She's doing what her electorate wants. She's listening to the electorate. Don't you understand that's the only thing a politician should do? And I said, I'm sorry, I vehemently disagree. He said, what do you mean? You couldn't possibly disagree. I said, there was no constituency for us whatsoever to tighten the budget. We had to argue the case day in, day out. We had to say to people, we're building a future. If we'd done what the electorate would have wanted at that time, when there was a debt problem and a productivity problem and a tax problem, the country would have been much further down the road. Now, to that person's great credit, he said, no one's ever put it to me like that. I get it. I understand what you're saying. You can't always do the popular thing. That's the first comment I'd make. But there's another comment I'd make, and I'd made it with great respect. It's tied to the idea that we disparage our politicians and then we end up with a lack of good ones. And it applies at the organisational level too. The branches in all the parties have become very weakened. It's not an age when people step up and have their go. And I've heard branch members say, I couldn't wait to get out of being secretary or whatever because they'd never listen. You can't give up if you're training for a marathon. You've got to be in it for the long haul. And this is the age of disengagement. We need people to engage again. And that means also paying careful attention to garnering the right people who can form a team. I've just explained why I think a team matters. You've got to train hard, hunker down together, not show what you're doing until you come out with the results. Defend them to the death when they're unpopular if you believe in them, and you'll get the fruit. Because remember, we won resoundingly after the near-death experience at the end of our first term because the fruits started to flow. People say, oh, they did the right thing by the country. I'm benefiting.
It's working.
It's working. Here's my gentle and polite but very firm request to people who are thinking of voting for independence, including the teals. Many of you live in seats actually that have done very well. You would think long and hard about your training, what sort of occupation you wanted to go into, what sort of specialisation you do. You'd think carefully about the house you bought. You'd think very carefully about the schools you'd send your kids to. Life's a complicated business. You'd want to be across a whole range of things. Please apply that to the running of your country. To vote for people and to resource people who campaign on one or two issues and will never be around the cabinet table forming a stable, tight government that is able to confront the great challenges confronting the nation. Defence, supply chain security, taxation, the management of the economy, the budget, education, trade, health. You want the right people around that cabinet table. And by definition, many of the seats that are voting teal are full of people who are immensely capable and that could do that job, but they need to be part of a team. There's an old saying, a team that's committed to one another will always do better than a team of brilliant players who don't work together.
John, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
G'day, just a reminder, if you want more news updates from the Squiz, make sure to click the subscribe button below.
We're your shortcut to being informed.